Now, most of you might have read the headlines or seen the thumbnail and immediately thought, well, please, dude, is this a Captain Obvious Day, or are we just stating obvious facts that everyone knows? And I think most people have that sense. But when we're talking about a failed state, that's not just saying that the state is failing. A failed state is something very specific, and it is actually quantifiable. And by the physical definition of a failed state, South Africa has not yet entirely met that demand. A failed state generally refers to three separate prongs, right? So the first is that the government is incapable of providing basic rights to its citizens. Basic rights in this case would be food and water. And while there are problems with the water and there are problems with food, as we covered yesterday in our video with kids starving in the Eastern Cape, there is still food and water en masse for most people in the country. So while the government is, I think, getting like a D minus, it's still basically passing, right? To some extent. We might make the case that it is limping, but hey, 30% is the pass mark. That means that they're still at least passing according to the South African education system. Another prong of this would be the government's ability to facilitate the business environment, economic growth. I think here we can make the argument that the country is failing. The government has not been able to get any sort of real economic growth going. And if we actually look at the forecasts for this year, in this year so far, the first quarter saw a 0.1% quarter-over-quarter growth, and the second quarter saw a 0.8% quarter-over-quarter growth. That's not good, by the way. It just really doesn't mean anything, because when you actually look, forecasts are always higher than what they tend to be. So you need to sort of look at all of these going down. But you look at most of these, and none of them have us even at 1.5, which isn't enough. We would need more than 5% economic growth for any sort of real growth to happen in our country. But okay, so this conversation by Dawie is incredibly interesting, because I think on that front, we can say the government has failed. Then when we go to the last prong, which would be the government's ability to keep its citizens safe and provide safety and security, I think there again, the government has failed. So out of the three, what I would refer to as the pillars of a functioning society, I think we can argue that our government has failed objectively on two of those, and the third, they're passing, but only because the pass rate is 30%. Let's say that. But okay, let's quickly go through this article. It's really interesting. There are different ways of looking at the role of the state and what it should provide. But one thing everyone can agree on is that it should keep its citizens safe. I am a libertarian and believe in a free market system. This is Dawie. But the primary function of the state, regardless of your ideology, is to protect its citizens. And I think we can all agree on that. Whether you're libertarian, whether you're more for protectionist politics, I'm a bit of both, right? I am a capitalist, and I do believe that the capitalist free market is important, but I actually do believe in a protectionist capitalist system, because I think government has a duty to protect its own markets. And I don't think that should be done at the expense of competition. I think it should be done by the government increasing competition, because the more competition you have in a market, the more robust and lively the market will be, the lower prices will become. So in that sense, I believe that the government should pass regulation to stimulate competition within the market, whilst not allowing for monopolies to form, because monopolies create sort of negative incentives in a way. But okay, so the country's murder detection rate has plunged from 31% in 2011-2012 to 12.4% in the latest release from the South African Police Service. We covered this a few weeks ago. It is called the Social Pact, whereby I fund the state through taxes in exchange for it protecting me and providing basic services. Now, here's where Ruud has an interesting take. Now, it should be mentioned that he's merely asking the question because suggesting this would be considered a crime, and you could be charged for treason for just saying that we should be doing this. So no one is saying we should be doing this. It's just a question. When citizens are forced to take the law into their own hands, it is a clear sign of a state that is simply failing in its primary function of protecting the people of the country. This is a dangerous place we are living in. And the reason is that the state is not doing its job and its duty. And here we go. We can rightfully ask the question whether we still have the responsibility and the obligation to keep on funding the state through our taxes. I want to just stop on this for 2 seconds. I do agree with him that at some point, this must become a question that we as South Africans are allowed to ask. I'm not suggesting that we do a tax boycott. That would be illegal, and I would never be permitted to stand for that or to push that. But we should ask ourselves the question, how long can a citizenry be expected to pay taxes to a state that isn't using these taxes? Because what he talks about there is the social compact, right? Or the social contract. This is the contract between the government and the citizenry. You give us money, we use that money in order to provide you with basic services. If the government isn't providing you with those basic services and basic protections, are you still obligated to pay your side of that social contract or social compact? And I think this is a legitimate question that one is allowed to ask. And you can look just at the murder detection rate of South Africa to see how it has steadily declined over the last few years. What is keeping South Africa from the edge? We're moving away from David's interview now. South Africa has been prevented from becoming a failed state by the resilience of some key institutions, such as the National Treasury, which I will admit, alongside SARS, might be the only two government functions, right? The only two government departments that actually function. SARS and National Treasury. National Treasury isn't great, but at least it's not gone down the let's just print ourselves out of problems scenario, which is fine, I think. And then the Reserve Bank. That's not going to last, though, because the ANC is already putting pressure. Okay, so why is the Reserve Bank? Let's just go there because some people might understand. A lot of central banks throughout the world have a dual mandate. America, for example, their Reserve Bank has, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. The mandate is, one, to protect the currency, but also to stimulate job growth. Now, the thing that has saved America and why inflation isn't rampant, and a lot of economists have actually said, one of the things that ties the Federal Reserve's hands sort of in protecting the dollar is the dual mandate. The fact that because oftentimes what you need to do to protect the currency is literally the opposite of what you need to do in order to create jobs. And one of the big problems is that the Central Reserve Bank or the central bank cannot create jobs, right? It can only create an environment that stimulates the economy. The problem with the environment that the central bank creates to stimulate the economy is it's mostly artificial. So what ends up happening is the Reserve Bank will either go on what it calls quantitative easing, which means it just prints a bunch of money and buys a bunch of stock. That just makes rich people much richer. It doesn't actually make anyone else richer, nor does it grow the economy in any meaningful way. It can lower sort of interest rates, but again, interest rates really only benefit, or lower interest rates really only benefit the very rich. It doesn't have that much benefit on the middle class, some, but not that much, and none on the poor, because the poor aren't the ones buying cars or homes. So lower interest rates will not benefit them in any way, shape, or form. So ultimately, whatever jobs the Reserve Bank can create, it isn't really creating anything, right? Not real growth. This comes from allowing business to do business. But when you make that one of its mandates, you put severe pressure on it. And this allows the Reserve Bank then it forces the Reserve Bank to start doing things that crashes the economy. The thing that saved America, remember I said, is the fact that everyone in the world uses the dollar. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So the dollar has value purely because America exists and people need to trade in dollars. If you removed that part, the Central or the Reserve Bank of America would destroy that currency. Now, our government has demanded the same. They want the Reserve Bank to start focusing on economic growth rather than just jobs. This has saved us up until now. But if this goes through, if the Reserve Bank buckles under this, it will destroy the rand. The rand has already lost about 99% of its value since 1994. It'll be way worse. Way worse. South Africa provides an incredible... Okay, so this is according to CEO Sim Chabalala from Standard Bank. And he says the following: South Africa provides an incredible example of how government and business ought to work together in a way that is properly governed and structured. This is largely in reference, okay, so we are working hammer and tongs in partnership to try to get GDP growth to above 3% this year, and that is completely possible. I doubt that. I highly doubt that you will get to 3%. But of course, he has to say this. Sim has to say this. The government owns the majority stake in pretty much every company of South Africa. So private citizens that are in business with the government has a vested interest to speak the government up. They have to make the government sound like they're good, like they're doing a good job. Because if they don't, the government can literally destroy these companies. Can you imagine 30% of Standard Bank stock just suddenly being dropped by the government? It would kill Standard Bank. And so he understands that even though, and you can sort of read between the lines here, right, where he says the government and business is doing really good, and this comes from respecting that business is not Caesar, and that Caesar must perform the role of Caesar is important. They must set up the legal and regulatory environment, but then frankly get out of the way so the business can execute and do what needs to be done. Read between the lines, he's saying the government and business works together really well. Business is doing what they're supposed to be doing, but government isn't doing. Because he goes on to say, please improve the quality of our institutions. In the case of South Africa, we use the lovely phrase, please capacitate the public sector. If you read between the lines, it becomes clear they're begging government to get out of the way so that we can actually start doing business. I wanted to show you guys even more of this because I think it's incredibly important. I wanted to go back to the chart that I showed you a few weeks ago. For every 1 rand that the government actually spends or takes in from taxes, how much does it actually spend? And here you have it, right? So 1 rand 23 is spent for every 1 rand collected in taxes. So we go into debt every single time the government collects taxes because they're spending way more than what they're actually getting. That debt, by the way, you and I pay for in the invisible tax called inflation. But then you look at government salaries and you see that government salaries make up 47 cents of the 1 rand that they're using. Services. Now, this is where I have a severe problem with how Grok breaks this down. And when you look at the actual data on this, it's absolutely perfectly fine. But the government says, right? The government says that part of its services that it provides is the relief funds that it provides to the 26 million South Africans. I don't view that as services. It's a salary. The people who are unemployed in this country that the government pays a monthly fee to are they're workers of the government. They don't provide a service. They don't do anything, but they work for the government. So if you were to remove that from this table, and just to put this into perspective, this is 1.1 billion rand that is spent every single year on services, goods, services, transfer, subsidies, and all the rest of it, right? 700 million of that 1.1 billion is spent on government grants. So if you were to remove the government grants, that number goes to like 15 cents that the government is actually spending in terms of on the people, right? In terms of services. And then you have the debt service cost, that is 22 cents. So of the 1 rand 23 that the government spends for every 1 rand that it collects, nearly the entire excess of that is paid just in servicing the interests of the debt that we have already accrued. So you want to talk about a failed state? This is a failed state. The point here is that South Africa as a country, about 99% of all of the money that we pay in taxes are completely lost to us. We will never see that return to us in the form of services of any kind, at least not the services that we ourselves would be using. Instead, the money that I pay, for every rand that I pay, 99 cents of that is either spent on government waste or spent on people who are not paying the taxes. This does leave one with a question. Am I still required to uphold my side of the social compact if the government has not upheld theirs? It's an interesting case study. I think one thing is clear. The government is failing. We have to pray. We have to keep heart, and we have to know that the fight is never over. We can win this. This government is not invincible. We can do this. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what I do and you think more people should have access to the kind of content I make, please consider hitting that like button, hitting that subscribe button, and leaving a comment, because it truly does help. Let me know what you would fix if you were in government. Massive shout out and thank you to all of the patrons as well as the YouTube channel members for your continued support. If you like and you want to do a bit more, just hit the link in the description down below or hit the join button right below this video. It's always very much appreciated. Be good to each other, be kind to each other, and I will see all of you in the next one. A peace.